The radio at the time was sort of like what today's social media is like. People were able to communicate or get information at rapid rates like never before. Charles Lindbergh and Amelia Earhart, very much a part of this popular culture of the time. They both were aviators or pilots, and Charles Lindbergh is actually the first person to ever fly across the Atlantic Ocean by themselves on his plane that was called the Spirit of St. Louis. Amelia Earhart, um, she's recognized as being the first female aviator. There were other female aviators around the time, but she is certainly the most famous one. And they both drew crowds out to come look at their planes and to see how these two people defied the odds during this time period was just a fantastic sight for most people to go out and see this. Just like before, where I said the 1920s was also known as the Jazz Age, that had to do with a lot of the music that was popular during this time frame. Okay, there were also a lot of popular fads and trends. Flagpole sitting, people would do exactly what that says. They would sit up on top of flagpoles for hours at a time. Um, Also, swimming the English Channel and other tests of endurance like marathon dancing. They had a lot of extra time. They had carefree attitudes that they were able to just really go out and have a good time. Um, there's also a huge surge of athletes that most people may not realize, but I'm sure that first athlete on there, Babe Ruth, is someone that most people would recognize right away. Okay, so these athletes all became very popular during the 1920s and really helped um, get these sports onto the radar of many other people. It was not uncommon for people to begin packing sports stadiums to see these athletes to be entertained. Okay, just like the radio and how popular it was, movies were also super popular. In the beginning, in the 1920s, they had basically silent movies all around. You would go to a theater, there might be a piano player who would play along with the movie, but the people in the movie would not be talking. By 1927, they have the first movie with sound, and that movie was known as The Jazz Singer. But at the movies, people were able to see a variety of different films. People packed these theaters to see westerns, romances, and gangster movies. And by the end of the 1920s, Americans were spending over $95 million in movie tickets each week, which is almost outrageous because there was only about 137 million people living in the United States at this time. There's also a lot of musicians and jazz musicians, I should say, that come around during this time. Duke Ellington is one of them, Louis Armstrong, Benny Goodman. Louis Armstrong is probably the one that you would recognize on here. Um, he sings What a Wonderful World, and I'm sure if we played it in class or you wanted to go and search it, you would recognize it immediately. There's also many writers that just have a huge impact on society. And they actually called these writers the lost generation. Um, and this lost generation, many of them were expatriates, and they lived outside of the United States, and many have considered themselves um, writers and artists, and they were carefree and they challenged all of the rules. Their books went from stuffy to outrageous. in comparison to things that were written in the past. So a couple examples were Zora Neale Hurston. She wrote Their Eyes Were Watching God, and she was actually an African American author. So that was pretty amazing for that time period. And F. Scott Fitzgerald, he wrote The Great Gatsby, something that you guys will probably be reading in the next couple of years. Also, John Steinbeck. There's a lot of writers from this time period that you would recognize if you took the time to look. So the Harlem Renaissance was an intellectual, social, and artistic movement that originated right here in New York, in Harlem, New York. Okay, it was the largest African American community that suffered overcrowding, poverty, and unemployment, but created this rebirth of African American pride because of all of the artists, musicians, poets, authors that came out of this time frame. Langston Hughes, African American writer, wrote many poems. You guys actually probably have read some of it in English class. W.E.B. Du Bois, you remember when we did our progressive unit, he's the founder of the NAACP. Marcus Garvey, he actually sponsored this Back to Africa movement, and he actually was trying to get African Americans to move back to Africa to restart and build a separate society. And some of the famous African American musicians to come out of this time frame, Duke Ellington and Louis Armstrong, just like we saw on the other page there. Some more pictures. There's Charlie Chaplin. There were dance crazes. There's a whole bunch of things going on during this time frame, and it was just a really great time to be alive and to be living, especially in the cities in the United States. So in 1928, Calvin Coolidge, he opts not to run again for president, and our two candidates are Herbert Hoover and Alfred Smith. Herbert Hoover was another Republican candidate. He was from the Midwest. So he's going to get a lot of the support from Protestants and small town voters. Again, people they know what a great time it is, and they kind of want to stick with what is working. Alfred Smith, he is a Democratic candidate. They known as Wet, former governor of New York. Okay, when we look at Wet, well, it's not like he was standing out in the rain. Wet meaning he was against prohibition. He was for alcohol in the country. So he's going to get a lot of support from the people in the cities. And he was also the first Roman Catholic to run for president. So he's also going to get a lot of support from those religions as well. This election really was about to just show you the tensions within American society. There was rural versus urban life, so farms and small towns versus big city life. Nativism versus foreign influences. Okay, people were scared of the immigrants that were coming over, and that the communism and the scares, and people really were just priding themselves and thinking they were better for already living in the United States for so long. We have the opposition and the supporters of prohibition. So you have the wets versus the dries. Protestants versus Catholics. Although they're both Christian religions, they have different ideals, and that causes some conflict, and many people were very hesitant to have a Catholic president, even up through JFK's election. But the big thing that I would say that you need to realize is that this entire era was really a traditionalist versus modern views competition throughout the United States. People were rejecting traditionalist values, especially in the big cities. In the end, Herbert Hoover wins this election by a landslide. And his philosophy for his administration is economize, save, and share. And Herbert Hoover is actually going to end up being our president during the Great Depression. But he got his start during a really great time in the United States. So didn't really see the Great Depression coming, but it's going to hit and it's going to hit soon. And that'll be our next unit.